At a bustling airport, an unexpected confrontation unfolded when a police officer began harassing Shaquille O'Neal in a way that shocked everyone around. Within mere seconds, the incident spiraled out of control, igniting an explosive scandal that abruptly ended his illustrious career. The explosion ripped through the quiet of the early morning, shattering windows and sending debris across the frost-covered lawn. Shaquille O'Neal stood frozen on the sidewalk, his coffee cup slipping from his fingers and splattering across the concrete. Time seemed to slow as he watched flames engulf the small recording studio, where just yesterday he had finally recorded the song that would change everything. Inside that building were the only copies of his work, 15 years of music, culminating in the one perfect song he had finally found the courage to record, the song that contained the truth he had never been able to speak. "No," he whispered, his breath visible in the cold December air. "No, no, no." A strong hand gripped his shoulder, pulling him backward as a secondary explosion sent a shower of sparks into the dawn sky. "Sir, you need to step back," the firefighter urged, but Shaquille couldn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the burning, building on the years of silence and fear being consumed by flames. "My recordings," he managed. "Everything I've ever written is in there." The firefighter's expression softened slightly, but his grip remained firm. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing we can do now, except keep everyone safe." Behind them, a crowd had begun to gather. Neighbors, in bathrobes, early joggers with phones raised to capture the disaster. Among them, Shaquille spotted a familiar face. Detective Carson, owner of the studio, his usually composed features twisted in horror. Their eyes met across the chaos, and, in that moment, Shaquille knew. This was no accident. As fire trucks wailed in the distance and the heat of the blaze warmed his face, Shaquille felt a curious calm descend upon him. The secret he had finally dared to reveal through his music, the truth about the night 15, years ago that had silenced his voice and changed the course of his life, would not be so easily destroyed. Not anymore. He stepped away from the firefighter's grasp, his gaze still locked with Carson's. His expression shifted from shock to something darker as he realized what Shaquille was thinking. "O'Neal," he called out, moving toward him through the crowd. But Shaquille turned away, pulling his phone from his pocket as he walked briskly in the opposite direction. His fingers trembled as he dialed a number he had sworn never to call again. "James Turner? It's Shaquille O'Neal," he said when the line connected. "I think I'm ready to tell you what really happened that night." 15 years earlier, Shaquille had been a different person with a different name. At 18, Shaquille O'Neal was the most promising songwriter to emerge from Blue Ridge Falls in decades. With his haunting melodies and raw poetic lyrics, he'd caught the attention of Triumph Records and its charismatic founder, Eli Turner. "You have something special, Shaquille," Eli had told him during their first meeting at the modest recording studio his son James had built on the edge of town. "A voice that speaks truth." That summer before college was a whirlwind of creativity and possibility. Eli became his mentor, encouraging him to dig deeper, to transform his personal pain into universal art. Under his guidance, Shaquille found himself writing with a freedom he'd never known, exploring the wounds of his mother's abandonment, his father's emotional distance, and his own search for belonging. "Music is the safest place to put dangerous feelings," Eli would say, his eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. At 45, he was magnetic, equal parts father figure and creative partner. He made Shaquille feel seen in a way no one ever had. But there was something unsettling beneath the surface of their partnership. Small comments about his appearance, a hand that lingered too long on his shoulder. The way his praise began to feel like a currency he had to earn through constant availability and gratitude. "You're overthinking things," his best friend Lacey insisted when Shaquille confided his unease. "He's Eli Turner. He could make or break your entire future." So Shaquille pushed his discomfort aside, focusing instead on the 5-song demo they were recording, his ticket to a music scholarship at Berklee College of Music. The night everything changed was unusually warm for September. Shaquille had been recording until nearly midnight, laying down vocals for a song about trust and betrayal that now seemed painfully prophetic. When Eli suggested they celebrate with a drink, he hadn't questioned it, despite being underage. His approval had become too important. "To your future," he'd toasted, handing him a glass of expensive whiskey in his office behind the studio. What happened next existed in his memory as fragments, the room spinning as he tried to stand, Eli's voice becoming distant and distorted, his hands on his body as he struggled to form words, the terrifying helplessness as his muscles refused to cooperate. And then James's voice, sharp with shock, "Dad, what the hell are you doing?" The argument that followed between father and son, Shaquille struggling to remain conscious, the sound of something breaking, a cry of pain, then darkness. He woke in his own bed the next morning, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. Only Lacey sitting beside him, eyes red from crying. "There was an accident," Lacey said, her voice hollow. "Eli is dead. They're saying he fell and hit his head after drinking too much." The next weeks passed in a blur of police questions, rumors, and crushing guilt. No one mentioned finding Shaquille at the studio, and he was too terrified to speak up. When Detective Carson had asked if he'd seen Eli that night, he'd lied, claiming he'd left earlier. The toxicology report on Eli showed only alcohol. James never contradicted the official story, but the one time Shaquille saw him after the funeral, the look in his eyes told him everything. Whatever he'd seen, whatever had actually happened, would remain their silent, terrible bond. 2 weeks later, Shaquille O'Neal disappeared from Blue Ridge Falls. He emptied his college fund, drove west until he ran out of gas money, and became a different version of himself. A waiter who sometimes played open mics but never recorded, never wrote down his songs, never stayed in one place too long. Until 5 years ago, when news reached him that James had reopened his father's studio. Something about that act of reclamation called to his broken spirit. He returned to Blue Ridge Falls, not as the young aspiring musician, but as Shaquille O'Neal, a songwriter passing through, looking for a fresh start. James had recognized him immediately, of course, but they maintained the fiction, never discussing the past, forming instead a careful professional relationship built on mutual silence. Until yesterday, when Shaquille finally recorded Partial Memories, a song that didn't directly name names, but spoke his long-buried truth through metaphor and melody. A song that would raise questions about what really happened the night Eli Turner died. A song that had now gone up in flames, along with the studio where it all began. "I can't believe you're going through with this," Lacey said, pacing across Shaquille's small kitchen. 15 years had transformed her from a carefree teenager to a tightly wound real estate agent, her youthful softness replaced by sharp angles and expensive highlights. After all this time, what good can possibly come from digging up the past? Shaquille watched his oldest friend with a mixture of affection and weariness. "The studio didn't burn itself down, Lace. So report the arson, but why bring up everything else?" Lacey stopped pacing, her manicured hand gripping the back of a chair. "You have a life here now. People respect you. Are you really going to throw that away by admitting you lied to the police 15 years ago?" There was something in Lacey's tone that made Shaquille look more closely at his friend's face, the tight line of her mouth, the way her eyes wouldn't quite meet his. "What are you afraid of, Lacey?" Lacey laughed, but the sound held no humor. "I'm afraid for you. Do you think people will thank you for sullying Eli Turner's memory? He was beloved in this town. His charitable foundation has put dozens of kids through college." "A foundation?" "Built on lies," Shaquille said quietly. "Built on your silence," Lacey corrected, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "A silence that protected everyone, including James." Shaquille felt his heart stutter. "What do you mean, including James?" Something flashed across Lacey's face. Guilt, maybe, or fear. "I just mean his reputation would suffer if people found out his father was inappropriate with a teenager." But Shaquille was already shaking his head, a cold realization spreading through his chest. "You know something. Something you've never told me. Lacey's carefully maintained composure cracked. "I know that you were drugged that night. I know James found you and his father, and they fought. And I know when I got there, Eli was already dead, and James was frantic, saying it was an accident." Shaquille felt the room tilt slightly. "You were there after I passed out?" Lacey nodded, tears filling her eyes. "James called me to help. He didn't know what to do. Eli had hit his head when they fought, and there was so much blood." She drew a shaky breath. "We were trying to protect you, Shaquille. If people knew you were there drugged, they would have investigated further. They might have thought—" "That I killed him," Shaquille finished, his voice distant to his own ears. "Or that James did, defending me." "It was an accident," Lacey insisted. "But who would believe that? Eli was powerful. His friends owned this town. So we brought you home, cleaned you up, and agreed never to mention you were there." Shaquille sank into a chair, 15 years of fear and silence rearranging themselves into a new terrible picture. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "Because you ran away. And then years later you came back. You seemed, if not happy, at least stable. Why would I destroy that?" The sound of a car door slamming outside drew their attention. Through the window, Shaquille saw James Turner, older now, gray-haired but with the same shrewd eyes, making his way up his walkway. "You called him?" Lacey asked, panic rising in her voice. Shaquille stood, squaring his shoulders. "Yes. And I'm going to tell him everything I know." He paused, meeting his friend's frightened gaze. "Including what you just told me." "Shaquille, please. I spent 15 years hiding from the truth, Lacey. 15 years of nightmares and running in silence. I'm done." He moved toward the door, then hesitated. "But I'd rather not have to tell him you knew all along." Understanding dawned in Lacey's eyes. After a long moment, she nodded, wiping away tears. "I'll tell him myself. It's time." The doorbell rang, its cheerful tone at odds with the weight of the moment. Shaquille took a deep breath, feeling strangely light despite everything. The truth, even painful, was better than the prison of silence he'd built around himself. As he opened the door to face his past, Shaquille realized that the song he'd recorded, the one that had burned in the fire, wasn't really gone. Its truth lived in him, and this time he would make sure his voice was heard. The preliminary arson investigation revealed accelerants had been used at multiple points throughout the studio. What the fire hadn't destroyed, the water from fire hoses had. Nothing was salvageable. Not the vintage equipment, not the framed records on the walls, and certainly not Shaquille's recordings. "I want to be crystal clear," James Turner said, looking between Shaquille and Lacey in the sterile interview room at the police station. "You're both telling me that on the night of September 15th, 15 years ago, my father, Eli Turner, sexually assaulted Shaquille while he was drugged. I intervened. We physically fought, and during that altercation, my father hit his head and died." "Yes," Shaquille confirmed, his hands steady around the paper cup of lukewarm coffee. "Though I only remember parts of it directly. I was unconscious for the actual death." "And you," James turned to Lacey, "arrived afterward, helped clean up the scene and transported Shaquille home, creating the fiction that my father had been drinking alone." Lacey nodded miserably. "We were teenagers. We were scared. Eli was untouchable in this town. No one would have believed us." James's weathered face revealed nothing, but his next words surprised them both. "I might have. I always had questions about that night." He sighed, running a hand over his face. "But that's water under the bridge now. What matters is what happened yesterday." "The fire," Shaquille said. "The fire," James confirmed, "which, given the timing after you recorded a song about that night, seems less like a coincidence and more like someone trying to silence you." Again, there was a soft knock at the door, and Detective Carson leaned in. "We've located the missing security footage, Mr. Turner. It shows someone entering the studio at 3 a.m. last night." Shaquille felt a chill. "Who was it?" "We're enhancing the image now," Carson said, "but it appears to be someone who knew the security code." James stood, gathering his notes. "I think we're getting closer to the truth." So the hospital room was dim. The afternoon sun filtered through partially closed blinds. Lacey Bennett looked small against the white sheets, an oxygen tube running beneath her nose. At 40, stress had aged her prematurely, though she maintained the poised appearance that had become her armor. Her eyes widened when she saw Shaquille enter behind James and Detective Carson. "You came," she said, her voice rough from smoke inhalation. "The security footage showed you entering the studio." "Last night," Shaquille replied flatly. "Why, Lacey?" Carson pulled up a chair. "Ms. Bennett, we have some questions about the fire." "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt," Lacey said immediately, looking from Carson to Shaquille. "I just wanted to destroy the recording. That song, it would have opened everything up again, all the questions, all the pain." She coughed, tears spilling down her cheeks. "And why would that matter so much to you?" Carson asked. Lacey's gaze locked with Shaquille's. "Because of what really happened that night 15 years ago." The tension in the room thickened. James leaned forward. "I'd like to hear your full account of that night, Ms. Bennett." Lacey closed her eyes briefly, then began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was in love with Eli Turner. We had been involved for months, even though I was only 17. When James called me that night, frantic, saying there had been an accident, I rushed over. Her hands twisted in the hospital blanket. When I got there, Eli was dead. James told me he'd found his father attacking Shaquille, that they'd fought, and Eli had fallen and hit his head." Carson made notes without commenting. "And then we decided to protect both Shaquille and James. Shaquille was unconscious, violated. James had fought with his father, possibly causing his death. If the truth came out, both their lives would be ruined." Lacey looked directly at Shaquille. "I loved Eli, but what he did to you was unforgivable. Still, I couldn't bear the thought of his name being destroyed completely, so I helped create the story that he had been drinking alone. So you cleaned up, took Shaquille home, and James called the police about finding his father," Carson summarized. Lacey nodded. No one questioned it. They wanted to believe the simple story. Shaquille felt a hollow ache in his chest. "All these years, I thought. I wasn't sure what happened after I blacked out. I carried this guilt, thinking maybe I'd—" "No," James said firmly. "You did nothing wrong. Nothing." Carson cleared his throat. "That brings us back to the fire, Ms. Bennett. You admit to starting it to destroy Mr. O'Neill's recording?" "Yes," Lacey said, her voice breaking. "The song would have raised too many questions. It would have destroyed the foundation, tarnished Eli's legacy. I couldn't let that happen, even after all he'd done." James was already on his feet. "The foundation was built on a lie, on my silence, on everyone's silence." But Shaquille remained seated, a final piece of the puzzle clicking into place. "You weren't just trying to protect his memory, were you?" he asked Lacey. "You were protecting yourself. Your relationship with him would have come out too." Pain flashed across Lacey's face. "Yes, I was 17, not much younger than you. It was a pattern with him." She met his gaze steadily. "I think part of me still believes he loved me. That what happened with you was different somehow, madness, right?" Shaquille felt sick. "And you never told me all these years." "We all keep secrets to protect ourselves, Shaquille," James said gently, "even from the people we love most." The final piece fell into place when Detective Carson found Lacey's journal documenting her decades-long obsession with Eli Turner. Her confession came quickly after that, how she'd maintained the shrine to his memory, how she'd feared Shaquille's song would tarnish his legacy, how she'd decided that destroying the evidence was the only way to preserve the fiction she'd lived with for 15 years. Standing outside the police station after giving his final statement, Shaquille felt hollow. The sky was darkening, winter stars beginning to emerge above the small town that had held so many secrets. "What will you do now?" James asked, coming to stand beside him. His face was lined with exhaustion and relief. Shaquille considered the question. The song was gone, but the truth was finally out. He felt lighter than he had in years, despite everything. "I'll start over, again, but this time I'll write it all down. Record everything. No more silence." James nodded, hesitating before adding, I still have the equipment from the old production booth in storage. It's vintage now, but if you wanted to rebuild something, I'd understand if you didn't want me involved. But the equipment is yours." Shaquille studied him, the son who had both saved and deceived him, who had carried his own burden of guilt and silence all these years. "I don't know if I can trust you," he said honestly. "I understand," James replied, turning to go. "But," Shaquille continued, making him pause, "I'd like to try. The truth deserves to be heard. Maybe we both have songs that need to be sung." Above them the stars continued to emerge, witnesses to the breaking of a silence that had lasted far too long. As Shaquille walked away from the station, he began to hum, then to sing softly, the melody of partial memories rising into the cold night air. The recording might be gone, but the song, like the truth, had never really been contained by the studio walls. It had lived in him all along, waiting for the courage to be voiced. Character count 14,972.